taking the stuff you know and arranging it in a way that can be understood. What I think this is about, it's about information and about how we use logic, I suppose, to work out where we are in the world. One of the most important things that art is supposed to do is to tell you where you are in the world, and I believe that's what I'm working on. I'm Henry Pym, and I've been working in ceramics for a really long time. I started actually at Camberwell Art School, which as it turns out is across the road from my studio, just near where I'm sitting now. And I graduated in the 70s and then did lots of different things. But for the last 20-something years I've been a teacher teaching at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin, where I was head of the ceramics department, ceramics area. It wasn't a department, it was an area. And I'm now retired, so I'm spending more time in the studio making these kind of things. So, although I'm amazingly old, what tends to happen with an artist's work is that it develops. So actually this is quite recent for me. This work is fairly new. I've only been doing it for about 4 years. Sculpture's an enormous subject. There are so many different ways that people can work, and they still call it sculpture. You know, you can paint somebody with blue paint and make them roll on the ground like Yves Klein did. Mainly he did that with very good-looking women, which was a kind of a nice way of spending your afternoon. That's called sculpture. Now, an example, I picked that as an example because, first of all, he didn't do much of it himself. He actually got someone else to roll on the floor, and he got someone else to paint the paint. And the main point about the sculpture really was that it was an event, it was a happening. And at the other end of the scale, you get somebody like me. I spend a lot of time very carefully and very skillfully making the work. So there's this gap between high skill, maybe long time, and highly finished object, through to something which you'd call an event or a happening, which depends on, in both cases I suppose, they depend on creating a mood, creating a feeling. The way I work is very technical or mechanical or skillful. It's usually, I love doing things with my hands, I love making things, and I love the opportunities that come from the making process. It's not an intellectual activity, at least not at first. It's a physical manifestation of the material. So the way that I got into doing these pieces is the same way as I've got into all my other work, is I start to handle the clay and get an idea for a process. And then, retrospectively, I tell people what it's all about. But it's actually about making, it's about skill. So I could talk about what these pieces sort of symbolize, but that's not where they start. They start from the actual making process. What I'm using is clay that has been made into a liquid. That's normally called slip. So you add extra water to the clay to make it runny, like custard. But the extra addition is paper fibre. So this is actually called paper clay, because mixed in with the clay is, well, really what you can describe it as is cellulose fibre, because paper is made of cellulose. And when you look at cellulose under a microscope, it's absolutely tiny tubes. So if you mix these little tiny tubes, like miniature spaghetti, if you mix that into the clay, then water can go into the clay and make it soft, or can leave the clay and it would then dry out and harden very easily. Normally clay is almost waterproof. In the old days, they used to use clay to line a pond. If they wanted to keep the water from sinking away into the ground, they'd line it with clay, because it's sort of, once it's wet, it doesn't really let any more moisture through. But if you've mixed paper in with it, it can dry easily and it can also wet down easily. The clay is also made stronger, at least before it's been fired in the kiln, by the fibres that are in it. So if you pick it up and just hold one of my grids that's made already, it doesn't break because the paper fibre holds it together. So I'm using clay in a form that's a little bit unusual. Most people who use clay wouldn't do that. And another advantage or the main advantage to paper clay is that you can take a piece of paper clay which is dry and you can join it to another piece of paper clay which is wet. So I can make a very delicate structure, allow it to dry, and once it's dry I can pick it up because of the fibre in it, and then I can join that to something else, which you wouldn't normally be able to do with clay that didn't have paper in it. There's a lot of sort of donkey work in making this. I have to mix the clay up, and when I'm mixing it I have to make sure that it's the right level of wetness, and then I have to mix up the paper until it turns into sludge, and then I mix the two together, and it seems to take forever, and then I have to squeeze out these panels. It's quite boring, actually. The bit I like is where it all goes together at the end, and it can take maybe 2 or 3 weeks to get ready to the point where the whole thing just flies together. I was working one day when somebody walked in the room and she said, "Wow, your work's so quick," because I was actually at the nice bit where it was like going together really fast. Pop, 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 it goes together. But actually it takes a long time, and you have to be watching the clay, make sure it's not too dry or not too wet, until you get to that moment when it all just gets assembled. You know, when they do these programs like Grand Designs on the telly, and they show people turning up with a lorry and loads of steel on it, and they make a house in an afternoon or something. It kind of gets to that stage with my work where you can just put stuff together and it looks like it's effortless, but actually there's a lot of planning involved before. But I love the effortless bit. Don't like making effort, really. When I'm looking at my own work, I start to think about other things other than the process. It's really by looking at the work that I begin to think how other people might look at it. It's one of those things where, you know, the other people will probably look at it and go, "I wonder how he made that," but they'll wonder that for about 2 seconds, and after that they won't really care. So I'm looking at it in terms of the sort of references that I associate with it and what it means to me. So there are a lot of built-in references to the idea of grids, and grids interest me a great deal. At one point I did a residency in New York, which, as you probably realize, is a giant grid. You know, Manhattan is arranged on a grid pattern. For some reason I started to make a lot of grids at that time, and everybody said, "Oh, that's because you're in Manhattan," and I think it might have been. I was there for a year, you know, and I kind of got used to the idea of living inside this enormous system of streets, and vertical as well as horizontal. You know, the buildings go up, but the streets are arranged as a grid. And so I thought of grids a lot, and I think of other artists who've used them. One of the things about imagining Manhattan is it's a map. You can think of it as a map, and grids are used for maps. So what is a map? It's a way of recording information. It's a way of taking the stuff you know and arranging it in a way that can be understood. So that is very much what I think this is about. It's about information and about how we use logic, I suppose, to work out where we are in the world. And one of the most important things that art is supposed to do is to tell you where you are in the world. And I believe that's what I'm working on. Another thing, I suppose, is structure. I spend a lot of time walking around looking at buildings as they're being completed. The new Tate Modern extension on the south bank of the River Thames is now being finished. I think it's much more boring now that it's being finished because they're covering up the outside of the structure with all these beautiful old bricks, or they look old bricks. But actually, while they were building it, you could see the steel and the concrete of the inner structure, which was fascinating. You could see how the building was held together, why it wouldn't fall down, that kind of thing. And so I look a lot at structures, and it could be a building, it could be a bridge. A couple of days ago, I was in St Pancras Station, which is a piece of 19th century engineering, and it's absolutely wonderful. So I get really excited about that kind of thing. Kind of embarrassing, really, but I do love structure. And I suppose finally, I like the idea of something being kinetic. When you actually look at a piece of my work and move your head, the whole thing shifts because you can see inside it. The view you get of the piece means that as you look through the holes in the piece, the whole thing starts to shift. And something that's kinetic attracts the eye. It makes you look at it. So there's a reason why people would look at the work, is because their eye is just attracted to it. Then they start thinking about why it's made and what it's for. The exhibitions that I have didn't all happen at the same time, or they were sometimes very close together. Everybody wants work, or sometimes like a couple of years waiting of nothing happening at all, which can be a bit annoying. So you've got to just roll with it. At the moment, one way that I'm getting attention is social media and putting stuff out, which is very, very important these days. You know, what used to happen was you'd take a lot of 35mm photographs and carry them around in a box and give them to people and say, oh, this is what I do. Now, of course, you post it up on Facebook or on your website or whatever. I don't use Twitter yet, but I should. And people kind of know what you do before you've bothered to show it to them because it's out there. Recently, I took a short video of one of the pieces that are in the room at the moment while we're talking now, and it reached 4,000 people. I was like, wow, that's great. I don't even need to get out of bed. I could just post stuff and people see it. And also recently, somebody walked into the studio. We do open studios periodically in this place. This is a group studio. And somebody came in and looked at my work and said, oh, this is everywhere. And what he meant was he'd been looking on social media and he'd seen it. So that's incredibly important at the moment, that you've got to be able to put stuff out so that lots of people know. So this morning, I got a phone call offering me to take part in an exhibition. It just happens. This is not it hasn't happened every day, but it just happened this morning that the person who rang me up had been looking at my website and knew exactly what she was taking on. She didn't need to come and say, I'm going to look at your work and discover whether it's absolutely revolting or not. She didn't need to do that. She already knew that she wanted it because she'd already seen it. And that's very important, especially for an artist, is that you give the gallery or the buyer the chance to review your work without the embarrassment of saying, well, actually, I don't like it very much. It's a really good arrangement because they can see what you're doing, they can see you, they can get the feeling of the ideas that are in the work. And if they think it's absolutely useless, they can walk away and nobody knows that they've looked. But if they like it, then they can use it. And that's really important to me at the moment, is to try and keep up my computer skills. To me, that's an alien territory in a way because I'm quite old, so I didn't start off learning about computers. But I can't imagine now operating without them. I can't imagine operating without Facebook and without the website. It would just mean no one would come to the studio. I think that's what would happen.